To show how all this works, I'm going to add ASP.NET MVC to my startup sample and create a simple view to show that the whole thing works. Now the first thing I need to do is add a dependency to the MVC package. So I'll come in here in project.json and add Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC. And in this case, I want to match the version of .NET Core that I'm using, so I want 1.01, and I'll save that change. Now, I will need to remember to do .NET Restore before I run the application because I've added a new dependency to the project. All right, now I need to come over and change my code. First thing I need to do is add a couple more using statements here. So I'm going to be using Microsoft.ASP.NET-Core.MVC. And MVC makes heavy use of dependency injection, so I need to add a using statement for that. So Microsoft.Extensions.Dependency injection. Gotta spell it right. And now I'm ready to modify my startup class. So the first thing I need to do is add an additional method here. It's public, doesn't return anything, so it's void. And it's configure services. And it'll receive an object of iService collection services. Yeah, I have a typo there. Let me fix that. iService collection. There we go. And I need to execute the add MVC method. Okay, and I'll explain what that does shortly. And then the other thing I need to do is come in here, and I'm no longer going to use the app_use method, because all that was doing was just demonstrating that we could process things and how the middleware path works. So I'm just going to select this block of code and comment it up. Oops. Okay, and now what I'm going to do instead is use app_use MVC. All right, so what I've done is I've added code that sets up the required dependency injection within configure services. And then I enable MVC for the application. And that's this statement right here. So this is a common pattern. Configure services here initializes dependency injection services, typically with configuration settings that are set up so that dependency injection creates types with the right configuration settings when injected. Configure, this method here, then adjusts the behavior of the middleware, which is typically a more specific wrapper around app.use. And if you look at the source code behind use MVC, you'll see that it is actually using app.use behind the scenes. So that's part of the reason I don't need to use it here. Although I can have as many app.uses as I want in the series of middleware that's executing within this application. And very typically, in full-fledged complex ASP.NET MVC applications, ASP.NET Core, you'll see a lot of steps, a lot of middleware, because it's using a lot of different services. Okay, and so methods like the services add MVC and the app.use MVC are extension methods that are provided by the specific implementation of what I'm using. In this case, it's provided by the Microsoft.ASP.NET-Core.MVC package. By the way, if you don't understand what dependency injection is, or if you haven't used it, don't worry about it for now. We're going to be covering it in some detail in the second part of the course, because ASP.NET Core MVC makes heavy use of it. Or more precisely, it's a technique that was available to us in classic ASP.NET, but since it wasn't really built into ASP.NET, it was very difficult. It required a lot of code, doing some kind of messy things in order to implement in classic ASP.NET. Now it's a full feature of ASP.NET Core, and so it's much easier to use, and it actually makes a lot more sense on what's going on. So don't worry about it for now. Okay, now the order of middleware here within the configure method is important. app.run, right here, is terminal middleware. So it'll run and not pass control to the next middleware by default. So the way I have configured now, .NET will attempt to satisfy the request using MVC, because that's the first bit of middleware that I have here within the configure method. And that's going to require that the URL is in a form that complies with a route definition. If no route matches, so MVC can't figure out what to do with this URL, then execution is going to fall through to app.run, and this code will run. All right, so you can have an unlimited number of steps here within the configure method, but you have to think through your application design so that everything runs as you expect. Now, in the case of MVC, there's no explicit configuration that's required. But other providers, like Entity Framework or a logging provider, might require that you set up a connection string in data provider, for example. So most of the .addWhatever methods typically have overrides that pass in some sort of option object with configurable properties or operations. So you may see some very complex method calls here, depending on what kind of middleware that you're using. Okay, so that's the code that we need to implement in order to minimally add MVC to this project. But now I need to create a controller and add a method to render a Hello World view page. Okay, and then you can take that and have multiple views and multiple controllers and route definitions and so forth. But we're going to take baby steps to start. Okay, so I have to add another package dependency here. This one is Microsoft.extensions.configuration.fileExtensions. And in this case, I want version 1.1.0.0. In fact, it kind of jumped ahead for me, so let's come back over here and get the list of possible ones. So you can see all of the available ones. And the one, this is out of sync with the rest of .NET Core. So the latest one that I have available is 1.0.0. Okay, so I need that version of that. So I'll save the changes to that file. And then I'll come back over here and save those changes, which I didn't do. And I'll come back over and do a .NET restore. And it'll go out, look for those dependencies, download those packages, and install additional dependencies needed by those as well. So as you can see, there's a lot of additional stuff that was added. Most of this is necessary for ASP.NET Core MVC. Okay? All right, it's a complex system, and Microsoft developed it with multiple layers of dependencies. Again, the nice thing is that NuGet takes care of creating those dependencies for us. Okay, so back over to our code now. Now I need to flesh this out and start adding the features to make this a viable MVC application. One additional thing I need to do is come back up in here and add another method here in order to configure that host object. So I need to add this useContentRoot method and pass in the directory object Now you can see why I added the file extensions, because I need to get the current directory. Okay, so that's going to be part of building up and bootstrapping the Kestrel web server. Now it's kind of interesting that use content root is necessary. But MVC uses the content root to figure out where the base folder for the application is, which is the location of project.json, that project.json file. Without this method call right here, things like MVC view resolutions or general purpose virtual to physical path mapping won't work. It may seem kind of superfluous. After all, we're running a console app and it knows where it started. But without used console root, anything that requires path mapping fails. So it's essentially enabling that mapping. Okay, so now we need to have a controller, which again, I'm going to continue this trend of putting everything into a single program.cs file. In a real application, typically this would be in its own file. But just for convenience in this very simple application, I'm just going to put all these classes into the single file here. Okay, so if you've done any ASP.NET MVC programming work with classic ASP.NET, this should all look fairly familiar. So I'm going to add a public class. I'm going to call it the home controller. So I'm hooking into the convention or over configuration. And I'm going to inherit from controller. And keep in mind that even if I was adding web services, because this is ASP.NET Core, I'm going to inherit from that same controller object because they've been unified in ASP.NET Core. Okay, so what I need is an action method. So I'll make a public. I'm going to return an action result. And I'll call it Hello World to keep consistent with our application so far. And in this case, I'm going to keep this first example very simple and say return content, which is a type of action result. And I'm just going to say it works. All right, and I'll save the changes to the file. Now there is one other thing that I need to do here, because we're not defining any routes yet. Typically that's part of configuring MVC here, but I haven't put anything there. So I want to explicitly identify the route for this. So this is going to be called Hello World. Okay, so this is a new route attribute that you can use. You can declare the routes either using attributes like this or defining routes as we've been able to do in classic ASP.NET MVC for quite some time. Well, in fact, classic ASP.NET routing is a feature that isn't specific to MVC applications. Okay, so I'm going to add a view later, but for now I'm just going to print out this message. I'm going to return this content, which will appear within the web page. Okay, so I'll save changes to that file, come back over here. I think I already did a restore, do one more just to make absolutely sure that I didn't add anything else. And okay, didn't have to do anything. In fact, it says the log file has not changed, so it's skipping that log file route. Right. Okay, and now I can run the application. Assuming everything compiles. Track record hasn't been too good. Oh, did it this time. Okay, so as you can see, now this is a web application. So once again, I need to go to my browser and refresh this page. And you can see that something is wrong. Okay, did that deliberately, honest. Okay, so what happened here is that if I come back over to Visual Studio Code here, kind of move that out of the way a bit. So what happened here is that this configure method started executing, and it came across this method. And so it first tries to treat localhost 5000 as a MVC request. And so it looks for a route that matches this, and there is no route. Remember, I didn't configure use MVC. I didn't configure the routes here. Instead, I configured just a single route right here that's called Hello World. That doesn't match what I provided here, so it can't respond to that request using ASP.NET MVC. And so it dropped out of this and executed this code here instead. All right, so now let's come back over here and use the MVC, execute that, and you see it works because now this is a route that it recognizes, and so it was able to find the proper controller and the action method to execute this code and display that within the page. Cool, so MVC is working. Now, let's come back over to our code here and modify it to use a view. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to comment out that statement there because we're now no longer going to return content, but instead use a view. And I'm going to pass some information to it. So I'm going to use a simple view bag and define a message property on it and say hello world. And then I also want to display the current time, which I certainly could from within the Razor View Engine, but I want to demonstrate some techniques here. And I'll use date time, now, and toString, and pass in that long time string again that I've been using. And then, just like in classic ASP.NET MVC, I need to return the view. And once again, I'm hooking in, I'm using all the default conventions, so I don't need to supply the view name or anything like that because I'm going to put the expected view name in the location where MVC can find it. Okay, so I'll save that. Okay, so I'm going to do that by coming back over here. I'll end execution there. And I'm going to make a views directory and make a home folder. Okay, so again, if you're used to ASP.NET MVC, this is going to be the default location of where it's going to look for views that are associated with a particular controller and action method. Okay, I'll go ahead and open up another code window and create a file called Hello World. Which it creates. Taking kind of a while there. Should open up another code window. That's interesting. There we go. It's just taking kind of a while. Okay, so what it did is it created this new helloworld.cs HTML file. And now I just need to add whatever HTML to the view. Now once again, I'm going to keep things very simple, and I'm just going to generate some basic HTML to display the information within the view bag. And another label for the time. I think I actually called that time. Okay, and I'll save the changes to that view. So the controller and view are simply going to echo out the ViewBag values from the controller as Razor expressions. Now, views within ASP.NET Core work as you would expect, supporting the full Razor and C# syntax. Now, I'm only setting and accessing ViewBag values here, but of course you can also pass a full-blown model object into the view, along with all of the cool features that if you've used ASP.NET MVC, you're used to. It supports all of that nice binding technology. Okay, I'm going to come back over to my other code window here. And there's one more setting that I need to change in project.json. And this is going to go in the Build Options section. So it's called Preserve Compilation Context. And I'm going to set this value to true. And save that change. This option is required for dynamic compilation of views. And if I didn't include it, I'd get a bunch of errors because of missing dependencies. Okay, so save that file, make sure I've saved everything I did, saved everything, there we go. Okay, so now I can come back up to my application directory, and once again do .NET run. Compiled successfully, that's always a good thing. And come back over to this page and refresh it. And as you can see, we are now seeing the view. It's displaying the message and the time. And we have a full MVC application complete with controllers and views. All right, so from here, you can build it out to be as comprehensive and as complex an application as you want to. So you can feel free to continue using your text editor of choice in the .NET CLI, but in the long run, you'll probably be more productive with Visual Studio once the tooling is ready for prime time, assuming that you're on Windows. On other platforms, you can use various other tools, and Visual Studio Code is a very credible candidate for developing .NET Core code. Okay, so at this point, we started with a plain console application, then added a low-level ASP.NET Core handler implementation, followed by an MVC view-based implementation. All of the code required to do this is in a single small code file that's grown to, what, about 60 or so lines maybe? Yeah, 60 plus lines. So it's really pretty amazing what you can accomplish just with fairly simple code and these basic tools. All the work on the sample application may beg the question, where is IIS in all this? So you may have noticed that I just ran a console application on Windows. There's no IIS or other external web server hosting the application. What's happening is that ASP.NET Core uses a self-hosted web server called Kestrel, and you might recall in an earlier section I configured that within the program.cs file. Kestrel is ASP.NET Core's high-performance web server. And what's amazing is all this is executing within a console application. The application itself is self-contained, running with its own private copy of .NET and its own web server, all of which makes the application very portable. Portable in terms of deployment, but also portable in terms of platform. You can host this application that I created on multiple operating systems. And, assuming that you don't use any platform-specific features, the application will run anywhere using the same Kestrel web server. Now, strictly speaking, the application is self-hosted and doesn't need a web server to run. But you really shouldn't use Kestrel itself directly over the internet. Instead, you should use a front-end reverse proxy like IIS on Windows or Nginx or similar on Linux to front the web server. The reverse proxy provides multiple bindings to the open HTTP, port 80 by default, and SSL, port 443, as well as potential load balancing and routing logic. All the features that we expect of modern web servers. So Kestrel is not that. There's also a native ASP.NET Core module that's installed on Windows and IIS that handles ASP.NET Core routing and process management. This native module is lightweight and still requires an application pool, but no .NET runtime. IIS doesn't do any direct request processing, but rather acts as proxy to forward requests to your application. Another benefit with this setup is that you can more easily set up load balancing, and you can have a single server that requires an SSL certificate, while the back end runs over plain HTTP. You can also hide your application web server from the internet, as only the IIS server needs to be publicly exposed. When running ASP.NET Core on Windows, IIS is relegated to the job of reverse proxying and process management. So it's quite a different way of how IIS interacts with ASP.NET Core compared to classic ASP.